Hi, this is Mr. Gideon. So in this first unit for business economics class, we've talked about a lot of business econ basics, and most of them have already been covered. You have them here in your notes, and as we've gone along, you've been able to expand on these. Of course, as I've said before, with the unit test that's coming up, you want to be aware of the fact that there's an excellent chance you're going to have to write at length for that test on the strengths and weaknesses of the three different basic kinds of businesses. And as it says here in your notes, which we've reviewed before, sole proprietorship, owned and run by one person, has its own list of strengths and weaknesses. A partnership, owned and run by two or more people, has its own list of strengths and weaknesses. And of course, the corporation as well. Now, if you were to have to write on the Unit 1 test about these three different kinds of businesses, understand that you do have to name as many as you can possibly remember. So if you're thinking, do I have to remember every single one? The answer is yes. Do I have to name them properly? The answer is also yes, if you want to get full credit. For instance, you can remember what the weakness unlimited liability is all about, but you can't quite remember that phrase. You can't remember to use the phrase and write down the phrase unlimited liability. Then you're not going to get full credit for listing and describing that weakness. For any strength or weakness, I want you to do both. I want you to be able to name the weakness or strength properly, as well as give just one sentence, maybe two, with an example if you feel you need to, that explains and shows that you understand what that term is referring to. Now, as you know, some of these strengths and weaknesses overlap. They repeat. For instance, you have unlimited liability as a weakness for a sole proprietorship, but also as a weakness for a partnership. If you're wondering whether or not you would have to name those each time, the answer is yes. But you only have to describe it once. So let's say that you write first about sole proprietorships, and when you're in the weaknesses section, you're explaining what unlimited liability means after naming it. When you get down to the partnership section and unlimited liability comes up again, you only have to name it there. You don't have to describe it twice. That would be wasteful. But I do want you to show that you know that that's a weakness for both business types. So if there's a repeat, you have to name it both times. So we've gone over all the strengths and weaknesses. You also need to know the definition of a corporation, a partnership, a sole proprietorship. But of course, there's other terms that we've talked about. You know that equity, stake, and ownership are interchangeable terms. We've seen many examples of this on Shark Tank. We've also talked about the difference between retail and wholesale, as well as mortgage, patent, trademark, copyright, royalty, and in perpetuity. All these terms, from patent to in perpetuity, referring to the area of intellectual property. Patent being the fact that if you've got an invention, essentially, and you're granted a patent, you have the exclusive right to profit from that invention. In the case of a trademark, you have, if granted by the government, the exclusive right to profit from and be associated with a name, symbol, or a figure, a lot of times referred to as a mark. If it's a copyright, also intellectual property, but a different type than the other two. This is where you're given the exclusive right to make copies, license, and otherwise exploit writings, essentially, or artistic work. So something more than a symbol, like you would typically have for a trademark. A royalty is a payment that's agreed to for the sale, usually a percentage of every product, service, or piece of intellectual property that is capitalized on. In perpetuity means for the rest of your life. We've also talked about how economics is the study of scarcity. It's the science of scarcity, the fact that there's not enough stuff for us to all get what we want. There is enough stuff for us to all get what we need, but we have unlimited wants in the attempt to fulfill needs that we all share. Microeconomics looks at decision making by individuals, individual companies. Macroeconomics is the subject of our AP class here at Chaminade, and it's looking at entire economies, combinations of individuals and individual companies coming together and forming one huge system. You saw either segments or full parts of films and documentaries that we made a big deal out of, particularly with regards to business ethics. So when it comes to harmful practices to avoid from the corporation, we were referring to the principle of business ethics called do no harm. Make sure you know the different ways that you want to try to avoid doing harm as a business owner. Also know all 5 parts of the supply chain, as well as how to try to be ethical in the different parts of that supply chain. There were some specific terms associated with the video, the story of stuff, that you also need to know. Of course, that would include planned obsolescence and perceived obsolescence, as well as the golden era of consumption, consumer sovereignty, all those things that I said you better make sure that you note as we go forward. From A Beautiful Mind, John Nash's lesson of cooperation is something you need to know, as well as the nature of cooperatives, like the cooperative union that we saw in Black Gold, founded and led by Teresa Mesquila. You also need to know, in connection with that, the principles of fair trade. There are 6 of those. And also, as I said before, the difference between wants and needs. There are unlimited needs. It's almost impossible to define, wants. It's almost impossible to define all the different ways that people try to fill those wants. But there is a relatively narrow list of needs that most psychologists agree that we have. Basic physical needs, as well as higher level or psychological needs. And we've talked about those as well. A couple of other things that we have not talked about. Some of these we've referenced, but we haven't gone in depth about. One is WIN, or win. This is just a principle I want to bring to your attention as a business owner. As we've mentioned before, you have to have the mentality, somewhat of a juggler, because there's so many different areas of your enterprise that you need to pay attention to simultaneously. Otherwise, the plates will come crashing down, and your company will too, your entire act, so to speak. But as you're going forward, you have to try as often as possible to ask yourself, from moment to moment, hour to hour, day to day, what's important now? What's the most important thing for me to focus on? Yes, I've got all these different areas of my enterprise, but if I want to win, then remember, in order to try to make a profit at the end of this enterprise, focus on, as of now, what the most important thing is. That's what WIN refers to. Also, from a basic sense, there are what we call the factors of production, and you've been working on these as we go forward. These are things that economists agree need to be in place for an entrepreneur to run and even just start up a company. Land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurs are the inventors, the risk takers, the creators, and the leaders of these companies, whether they're new or existing. That's in a different category. It's a different factor of production than labor. Labor refers to workers. Land is the physical space that you need to operate, and land is required even if you have a purely internet-based company. And capital is 2 types, financial and physical. Financial capital is essentially money that you need to start with, that at some point you will turn at least some portion of into physical capital, whether it's a cash register of some kind or other kinds of equipment. Maybe it's chairs and tables that you need to operate a restaurant. But physical capital and financial capital are related. One is cash or other forms of money, if you want to think of it that way. But there's also physical capital. So for instance, when we were starting up Higher Grounds Cafe, and we determined that we needed to have different kinds of equipment, one type of equipment was strong, heavy-duty, and automated blenders. Each of those blenders cost $1,000 to get. So we had to start with at least $4,000 of financial capital, but quickly turn it into $4,000 worth of equipment, or physical capital. Depreciation. This is the loss of value over time through wear and tear and through use. So going back to those physical blenders, depreciation occurred over a period of time because they were used very frequently. And at this point, the time of this recording, this is fall of 2011. It's roughly 4 years after we bought those blenders. As you can guess, they would not be worth the full $1,000 price each if we wanted to sell them on Craigslist or using some other way to sell them used. When something's used, of course, it loses value, and that's depreciation. Of course, the opposite of that is appreciation. And some products will go up in value over time, depending on the demand and the value of that product as time passes. Opportunity cost is the second rank choice that you give up when you finally make your top choice. And the reality is, as you go forward in this whole process as a seller, you'll realize that you have to narrow down your activities to the most important. Kind of builds on this principle of WIN, what's important now. And you might start by thinking about 20 different sizes or colors or variations or flavors of whatever product you're thinking of selling. But the reality is, to minimize your cost, you can't sell everything that you want. And so you have to make a decision. And once you make a decision on maybe just a few possible items that you want to sell for profit, then you give up the opportunity to make profit on the other items that you forego. It's not just a concept that applies to selling, of course. Since, for instance, you took this class as an elective, I'm sure you had other choices, maybe a second-ranked choice that you had in mind that you ultimately decided not to take action on because, of course, business econ was your first choice. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. Well, whatever that second-ranked choice was an opportunity. I'm sure a very worthy opportunity, but something that you chose to give up because there's only so many classes you can take. There's a limit to the electives you can take, regardless of the grade you're in. And so when you finally made that choice, there was a cost involved. It was the opportunity that you gave up to do that other thing. Tinstaff, Tinstaf, refers to there is no such thing as free. It's an acronym that stands for that entire phrase. And this is something that we come back to time and time again, because whether you're selling and you're offering something for free, or you're acting as a consumer and somebody's offered you something for free, there really is no such thing. At the very least, it takes time, energy, and perhaps money to consume whatever it is that you ultimately decide to consume, or to put your resources toward. And so, of course, because there's an opportunity that was lost, like I explained, an opportunity cost, there really is no such thing as free. I mean, think of an example of going to a baseball game, a pro baseball game. My family has been friends with some families that have been able to get us free Dodger tickets in the past. In the case of those Dodger tickets, were they truly free? Well, we still had to pay for gas to get to the stadium, so that's not free. But let's assume that they were so nice that they said, we really don't want the Gideons to pay for anything this day. We're going to give you not only the tickets, we're going to pay for your gas. Just give us a receipt when you're done and we'll reimburse you, as well as parking there at the stadium. Is the trip to Dodger Stadium truly free? No, because there's still some other opportunity that we gave up by taking the time and the energy and still putting some resources toward attending the game. Could have stayed home and done some gardening in the backyard. There is a value that's placed by economists on leisure time. Maybe we could have worked a part-time job and made a little extra money, or taken a very short session to improve our education or knowledge in some area. And so many times when somebody says, well, I got something for free, we jokingly stop them if they've taken business economics or AP economics, even global economic leadership, and say, well, there's not really anything that is truly free in the economic world. Now, just a couple of other terms, like costs, which of course is the money that you have to pay to acquire something. The costs that are relevant in this class will be the cost of your supplies. Marginal cost is the extra or additional cost that you would have to pay for one more. So of course, if you have to buy 10 of something, that's a different cost than buying 11. The extra cost to get you from 10 to 11 would be an example of marginal cost. More often what we do is we refer to the cost of just one item. And of course, that breaks down to a little different average depending on how many you buy. Be careful about being sucked into buying large quantities of supplies this semester for your company just to reduce your marginal cost. Because if you can't sell it all anyway, what use is there in having a really small marginal cost? Because you still won't make a profit. Marginal benefit is the flip side of that. Marginal benefit is the extra, because that's what marginal refers to, or the additional benefit that somebody gets from consuming or using or participating in some kind of activity. And this is actually tied to the next term, diminishing marginal utility. So you can see these two terms side by side. And the smartest people are the ones that think at the margin. But what does all this mean? If you compare marginal benefit to marginal cost, whether or not you think of those terms, then you're a smart decision maker typically, because you say to yourself, you know what? I don't know if it's worth it for me to expend one extra unit of cost to get one extra unit of benefit. Maybe at some point I have to be smart and balanced and understand that there is such a thing as diminishing marginal utility. Diminishing meaning decreasing, marginal meaning extra, and utility meaning usefulness. So what's an example? Well, I won't say who it was, but let's just say that an economics teacher in the past was trying to teach this concept of diminishing marginal utility and issued a challenge one time in a block class like yours. He came into business economics and he said, all right, everybody, I want you to learn about diminishing marginal utility, and I'm going to explain it. And he did. He said, but as an exercise to really help it sink in, I'm going to have a challenge. It's the first block of the day. I'm guessing that at least some of you haven't had breakfast this morning, because I know that's an option and a habit, in fact, for some of you teenagers. So I thought ahead, and I decided to bring in a dozen donuts. Now, if any of you are interested in having this box of dozen donuts, I will give it to one of you for free. They should have known at the time that it was a bit of a trap, because there is no such thing as free, but that's a different matter. And so he said, you can have this box of dozen donuts for free if you eat the entire dozen all in one block period. Otherwise, if you can't do it and you can't keep them all down, you have to pay me for the dozen. So of course there were a couple of students, pretty brash, pretty cocky, that said, I'll do the challenge. And so the teacher decided to pick on one who looked particularly cocky. And so it was a boy. The boy came up to the front of the room and he said, all right, I'm all over this, man. I love donuts. I can eat a lot, and I haven't had breakfast this morning. So he starts off plenty strong. What do you think he had in terms of his marginal benefit or marginal utility going from the second to the third donut? Probably relatively high. And of course his cost was really low. No financial cost, and the way he was acting, he had plenty of room in his stomach. But as he got from the 5th to the 6th, he started to slow down somewhat. When he got from the 8th to the 9th, yes, he got that far, he started to severely limit his marginal benefit, and the cost, in terms of his physical discomfort, started to go way up. And as you can guess, he had diminishing marginal utility. When he was done with that 9th donut, as you can guess, this was no longer a sideshow. The teacher was trying to teach. He should have never tried to do that, because inevitably it was going to be way too big a distraction for the class. His buddies, the students' buddies that is, were cheering him on. He got to the 10th. He didn't look so good. He pulled a trash can nearby just in case he had an accident. But of course his boys are going, you got this, man, you got this. Come on, man. Pushed himself, got the 11th down barely, picked up the 12th. At that point you had the entire class standing on their feet and cheering for this guy, cheering against the teacher. He took a bite, he took another bite, and then all the other 11 came up. Now, whether he won the bet or not, the point is, I hope, that it's obvious how to understand diminishing marginal utility. And this student's marginal utility was decreasing very quickly as he got closer to the end of the dozen compared to when he was at the beginning of the dozen. These are the kinds of decisions we have to make. They're not always quite that dramatic, but we think at the margin. If you're walking along the street and you say to yourself, wow, look, there's a dime. Do you pick it up? For some people, it's worth their time. The small bit of extra cost in terms of time, energy, to bend down and pick up that dime is worth it because the marginal benefit outweighs it. But for some other people, let's say you're a multimillionaire, it's not worth your time most likely and your energy to bend down and pick up that dime. It might not even be worth it to bend down and pick up $1. If you're on your way to an important meeting where you're getting paid $10,000 or $20,000 or $100,000 to speak, and you have a reputation for being on time, might not be worth it. So we all make these kinds of decisions, and hopefully this makes sense. You're going to have to make those borderline decisions as well as the semester goes on. And you're going to be thinking about incentives, which are ways to get people to act the way that you want them to, offering them rewards, or disincentives, which are punishments. And there are other kinds of concepts in this class, of course, going forward. No one's going to force your customers to buy with you. It's going to be a free and open trade. And they're not even going to be forced to be at school that day. Like so many times in the past, we're operating and having a sale day that exists once school has gotten out, at least once X block is kicked in. There have been promenades in the past where I've been fortunate enough, or at least my students have been fortunate enough, to have a special schedule and essentially trap all the students at school so they couldn't go anywhere, they couldn't leave campus, and that increased sales. That doesn't fit here at Chaminade, but it's more realistic. That's how most businesses operate. People can come and go as they freely choose, and you have that type of trade in place. Understand too that there's a difference between profit and revenue. Revenue is the money you make, the money that customers give you, but profit is what you keep. There's a big difference. Profit is the revenue minus the cost. And hopefully once you do that simple math, you have some leftovers. That's considered profit. Otherwise, you have what's called a loss. Also in this class, you have private property. Of course, nobody's giving you any money nobody's giving you much in the way of physical capital to operate your company. You might be able to borrow some in limited cases. Private property is not a concept that all countries or all cultures take for granted. Think of an example in history where Mahatma Gandhi had famously woken up to find that somebody had stolen from him in an ashram, which is a communal living experiment that he put together to show how people can live together from different backgrounds in peace. How depraved or desperate do you have to be if you're going to steal from Gandhi? But someone did. And when he found out, he said, well, it didn't belong to me anyway, it belonged to the universe. I hope they needed it more than I did. And he didn't have this concept of private property. But in our country, and many Western countries and economies, we do have this concept, and it's reinforced by the law as an incentive for people to work harder, whether it's as a laborer or an entrepreneur. So private property is exactly that. It's something that's owned. And it's something that you know, whether you know the term or not, from a very young age. If you've got a sibling, and that sibling takes one of your toys, you say, don't do that, that's mine. That's my private property. In some cultures, that's not the mentality. Not that it wouldn't be wrong to take something that somebody else has. But don't take that concept for granted. Also, these last two terms, specialization and voluntary exchange. Voluntary exchange fits with trade, and that's essentially what I was describing before. The kind of trade that you have is voluntary. You have a lot of flexibility on your side. It's not just that it's voluntary whether or not the customers decide they want to buy from you and vote with their dollars, exhibiting consumer sovereignty. But also, you have a wide degree of freedom yourself to sell a lot of different kinds of products and services. Of course, there are some parameters, but you have a lot of creative freedom as the entrepreneur in this project on your side of voluntary exchange, of course. Hopefully, as you go forward, though, and you try to juggle all those different plates, you are smart about organizing your time, making decisions at the margin, weighing marginal benefit and marginal cost, and if you have friends helping you, whether they're partners in your block or they're students outside of the class, maybe even parents and family members that you get involved, you also use this concept of specialization, where people will specialize in a certain task or skill to try to increase the speed and efficiency that your company will display. In the Global Economic Leadership class, GEL, this year-round student company that I've mentioned before, Eagle Eye, has a high degree of specialization. We have two students in a finance department. One's a bookkeeper, the other one's a chief financial officer. They have different kinds of tasks, whether it's keeping track of financial transactions and sales, or reporting the overall financial health of the company. and there's a degree of specialization within the department, but that department itself specializes very differently than other departments. We have 3 different students who are in charge of film breakdown. Once video of a game and possibly even practice has been put to the online site, we have a different group of students whose only job is to videotape games. That's a degree of specialization. That's the only thing that they do. Whether they're doing it from the ground level, they're doing it high above the press box. We have 2 of each. There are other students who do promotions, including flyers, banners, website, and there are many, many different examples of specialization in that class with a total of 27 students. Try to take advantage of this concept, and I highly recommend that you do. And I also recommend that you use all of these concepts as you move forward this semester toward what is hopefully a very positive ending for your project and an opportunity to make a profit.